All right. Hello and welcome everyone to today's Condition of the State webinar, the second in our series on excess coal generation. We're delighted to have you with us this morning. We've still got several people logging in and joining us, which is fine, but we're going to go ahead and get underway today to talk about this topic. We are recording the webinar, just a note for folks on the call today, so that we can make that recording available to attendees who were not able to join us and to publish that out on YouTube as well. So please note that this webinar is being recorded. I'd like to go over a couple of other presentation guidelines for today's event. We are in a webinar format, and so attendees will be off camera and muted by default. Please note that just our presenters will be available on camera. We ask that you utilize the Q&A tool if you have any questions. You can find that Q&A tool by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen. And then our presenters will address the questions either live during presentation, using the chat tool, or we will have time for live Q&A at the end of the session. So please feel free to place your questions there. And then we ask that you use the chat tool to let us know if you're having any technical issues, if you can't see anything or hear anything. You can let us know using the chat tool. So I wanted to start off by just briefly introducing you all to the Iowa Environmental Council. My name is Angelisa Belden. I'm the Communications Director here with IEC, and I'm pleased to be welcoming you all to this event and telling you a little bit more about IEC. We are a statewide nonprofit, non-governmental organization based in Des Moines that's focused on growing clean energy and providing clean water in Iowa all around the state. We do the bulk of our work on policy, research, advocacy, education, and outreach. We have more than 90 member organizations made up of both nonprofits and for-profit businesses, and 15 professional staff on site. So we are a mighty group, and we're growing and looking to do more across the state of Iowa. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters for our session. Our primary presenter will be Steve Dyer, our Energy and Climate Policy Specialist here with IEC. And assisting him in answering questions and being available for further comments is Carrie Johansson, our Energy Program Director. So I'm going to turn things over to Steve to get you started talking about today's program.
Thanks, Angelisa. So many of you may have been on the first webinar. This is the second in a series of three, basically covering the state of Iowa generation. And so the topics today will look at the 20 years of change that have occurred basically in the state. We'll look at the cost of generation. We're certainly going to talk about excess coal calculations and what that means. We'll equate that to coal plants that could be retired. We'll also look then at the total 2020 excess generation. We're going to look at the excess emissions and the waste that basically resulted from that generation. Now we're going to talk about the impacts of those excess emissions and something a little new. So we're going to look at crop loss and mortality, and also then do a crop loss comparison. In other words, if we looked at doing all renewable, how would that actually compare to the crop loss as a result of coal? So the 20 years of change, it has been dramatic. And so from 2000 to 2020, clearly, as you can see from the chart, coal in 2000 was the dominant source of electricity generation in Iowa. And then in 2019, for the first time, wind actually resulted in basically crossing coal. And you can see the lines basically cross there, where wind generation became the dominant source of generation. And in fact, in 2020, wind actually represented 60% of the generation in Iowa. And you can also see the precipitous decline of coal generation. But you'll also notice the natural gas generation that basically has increased quite a bit since 2014. So we have to ask why. What are the drivers? Why are we seeing this dramatic change in terms of generation sources being used? And it's not just Iowa. This is occurring across the country. And the reality is it's largely because of the cost of energy and the cost of those generation sources. And so this is from Lazard. And what I think is important about this one, if we look at this, you'll hear many times that, well, the only reason that renewable basically is viable is because of the subsidies. But this is an analysis that is looking at the unsubsidized, in other words, no tax credits. And so renewable, and that's wind and solar both, now represent the lowest cost forms of energy. And you'll also see on the bottom comparing to conventional resources. And so you got um, the little diamonds representing basically ranges of existing, but then you're also showing what it would cost to build one of those new plants. And so again, this is part of it. Certainly there are drivers environmentally and climate change that are also driving this trend, but largely it comes down to the cost of energy itself. So if you saw basically the first webinar, we sort of explained the concept of excess coal generation. And so what we have, and we start with basically the customer load from both Alliant and Mid-American. And then as we look at the environmental aspects of each source of generation, we're going to start subtracting from those that are the lowest impact to the highest impact. And coal generation is by far the highest environmental impact as far as a way to generate power. So as we subtract wind as being the viable and preferable source, then nuclear we place right after that. Other resources are in there, and that largely is the result of purchases that aren't necessarily identified, but given market conditions, the presumption is that a lot of that is actually wind. Then we subtract the fossil gas resources. And by the time we subtract those resources, what we see is that for both Mid-American and Alliant, the coal generation really was not necessary to serve that customer load. And so we're going to deem that to be an excess coal generation. You'll see respectively that it totals just a little bit over 10 million, basically, megawatt hours. So where are those plants? And so again, for 2020, all of the coal generation was excess. It didn't necessarily serve the needs of those customers. And so the plants that we're talking about, and I put them on the map here so you get a perspective geographically also. So the Neil 3, Neil 4 is around Sioux City. The Walter Scott plants 3 and 4 are Council Bluffs. Ottumwa, as the name implies, Ottumwa. Loiza is just outside of Muscatine. Prairie Creek 4 is in Cedar Rapids, and Lansing similarly is in Lansing. And so the total excess generation was, the actual number was 10,433,632 megawatt hours, all resulting in emissions and fly ash basically unnecessarily in this state. So let's take a look at what that quantity is in terms of the actual emissions itself. You'll see that, and by the way, the numbers that you're looking at here was categorized not by percentage ownership, but actually was attributable to the actual operation of the units themselves. So we had significant everything, excess sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, carbon dioxide, which is certainly relevant right now with climate change impacts and the IPCC most recent report, and fly ash that basically is put into landfills, or appropriately a monofill, in other words, a special purpose landfill just for the fly ash. The numbers are still large, even though the coal generation is significantly reduced, but we're still looking at 14,000 tons of sulfur dioxide. A significant one in mercury, because 74 pounds or almost 75 pounds of mercury is substantial when we look at the toxic aspects of what mercury actually can do to groundwater and or surface water. And then carbon dioxide, again, that's still a significant number in the state. It certainly is attributable to, and still, I believe the power plants represent currently in the state about the 3rd largest source of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases still at this day, even though they were at one time the largest, but now they are still number 3. So let's look at each of these, and we're going to look at what the impacts of this actually accounts for, or what it is. So the first thing we're going to look at is mercury. And so mercury is certainly a basically, and by the way, the largest aspect with these impacts is that air emissions, you don't see it. And so it has aspects that we don't really take into account. Certainly, whether we're talking about our own health and or basically the environment. And so again, mercury, basically the coal plants in the U.S. represent 44% of overall mercury emissions. It's a very toxic metal. Basically has serious consequences, basically for child development, the nervous system, and it takes very little to actually contaminate large areas of water. So just 1/7 of a teaspoon basically can contaminate a 25-acre lake, making the fish unsafe to eat. And so again, at 75 pounds, that's a lot. And so we chose to try and quantify that, put it into perspective in terms of what does that really mean. So at 75 pounds, that's enough to contaminate a 876,000 acre lake. Or if we want to equate that to square miles, that's 1,369 square miles. So what does that mean to Iowa? Well, Iowa actually only has 416 square miles of water. So in 2020, that means that we emitted enough mercury from these plants to contaminate all the state waterways 3 times over and potentially making the fish unsafe to eat. So even to provide more geographic perspective, because I know it's hard to associate, well, what does this mean in terms of size? I mean, we don't normally think in terms of basically what's a square mile actually look like, or 1,369 square miles. So turns out that if we were to take all the land mass in both Fayette and Ellicott County, just to get perspective, that's what 1,369 square miles basically actually looks like. So if you thought about those two counties as being one large lake, that basically is the amount of contaminated water that we'd be looking at. And again, if we had actually 3 times over the mercury basically emitted, then it says that actually our risk is actually greater that we have contaminated water in the state and potentially contaminated fish within the state. So sulfur dioxide. So many of these pollutants were basically first addressed as a part of the acid rain program. Back in the 70s, basically when the Clean Air Act came into being, our air basically was far worse than it is today, but it's still a very significant portion of emissions, and even with controls, which by the way, all the plants in Iowa have the controls, but that's still a lot of sulfur dioxide being emitted into the air. And 2020, that was 14,563 tons. Now, if we take a look at that, why is this so important? Again, I come back to the same theme, which is we can't see it. Even though it basically is impacting us, I mean, it's sort of, I refer to it as sort of a silent killer because you don't see it, but it certainly is having an impact on our overall health. It forms acidic particulates basically that can penetrate the human lungs, and it's clearly been linked to asthma, bronchitis, a portion of the smog, again, acid rain, deposition, which used to be greater than it is today, and damaging crops and other ecosystems. And again, same thing, it also can acidify the lakes and the streams. So it has an impact everything around us, but we just don't see it. So similarly, I mean, nitrogen oxides also basically are being emitted. In this case, we had 9,684 tons being emitted in 2020. Same thing, it irritates lung tissues, it exacerbates asthma, makes people more susceptible to chronic respiratory diseases. So even something like, for instance, COVID, nitrogen oxides has the potential to actually make people more susceptible to this because it in fact is a respiratory disease. So it's significant. Now we see nitrogen oxides every once in a while, not tremendous, but so when we take nitrogen oxide and we combine it with VOCs, volatile organic compounds in the atmosphere, and in direct sunlight and the right temperatures, that's what actually forms smog. And occasionally we see that. I mean, admittedly, we're probably seeing more impacts from the wildfires right now, but we do see this from the nitrogen oxides also. So particulate matter, again, the name is, I'll just say, somewhat deceptive because you really don't see it, even though it is a solid substance, but it is there. So we had 1,463 tons of it emitted from, again, the excess coal generation in Iowa. It sometimes can look basically ashy gray and coal smoke, but again, a lot of times you don't even see it, even though it's circulating within the air. That too can also be something that aggravates asthma. It has cardiovascular effects, significantly. It can lead to heart attacks, premature death. So again, many of these emissions, I keep repeating, it's just like we don't see it, but it's having a significant impact on our health. And probably the biggest one of all, certainly, again, given the international basically report released by the IPCC that clearly says warming is occurring. It is basically human induced, and that it's accelerating far faster than we thought it was going to. So in Iowa, and by the way, this is a slightly different number because this is actually for all the coal plants in Iowa. And so beyond Mid-American and Alliant, there are some coal plants owned by municipal utilities. And so this also accounts for even the gas generation basically too. So this is total CO2 or carbon dioxide emissions basically in Iowa in 2020 at 16, again, a little over 16, almost 17 million tons of carbon dioxide. And so if we take a look at that, the significant thing about burning coal is that it's very, very, I'll just say, deceptive in terms of how much CO2 actually gets emitted. In fact, I believe that the equation is, in fact, for every 1 gram of coal, basically you end up with 4 grams of CO2. So it multiplies in terms of the amount of coal going in, and you actually end up with more CO2 coming out. Back to climate change. I mean, these are becoming very significant impacts on not only Iowa, but everyone else. I mean, I'm sure everyone probably maybe remembers just a little over a year ago, on August 10th of 2020, we had the derecho come through with significant impacts. I mean, it devastated the Cedar Rapids tree canopy. We ended up with corn and soybean loss, multiple building loss, all the way, basically stretching all the way through the central portion of Iowa through Cedar Rapids, but also it ran across, as many know, all the way through a large portion of the Midwest, and resulting in damages to Iowans and Midwesterners totaling $11 billion. And unfortunately, this is probably something that I think we probably can expect to potentially see more, and probably need to get our arms around it more quickly. Again, given what the IPCC is saying, that as they analyzed it, they were looking at what do we need to do to get everything under control. And one of those is we have to basically stop using fossil fuels and do it more aggressively and quickly than maybe what we thought previously. So I'm going to switch over a little bit, and this was something actually new. This is a report from a couple of years ago. It was a study came out of the University of California, and what they looked at was they studied basically the period of 2005 through 2016. And during that period, we had quite a few coal plants that actually closed in that time frame. And the analysis looked at what happened to not only mortality rates, but corn yields as we look at the regions and the areas where those coal plants actually shut down. And so we even had those, in fact, impacts were noted in Iowa. And so when plants closed, they basically found that not only did the mortality rates decrease, but the corn yields actually increased over that same time frame. And for perspective in terms of the range they were looking at, so they studied mortality within 25 kilometers of each of the closed plants. But then the corn yields, they actually found stretch out much further, that they actually observed increased corn yields as much as 200 kilometers away from wherever that particular plant happened to be. And so in this case, what they found is that in Iowa, you can sort of see the shading there. So it was looking at basically somewhere in the range of 1 to 50 to even possibility of even up to 100 people, basically lives saved in those counties when the coal plants basically closed down. Notably, when we look at what that little blue spot there, that's Lynn County, and there were several plants, both 6th Street Station and Prairie Creek stations, that closed in that actual area, and certainly seems to have attributed to what they found in terms of lives saved, decreases in mortality. And then the aspect of, which was, I think, unexpected, but corn and bushels of corn saved, or in other words, increases in yield that they observed over that time frame after the plants closed. And so this is millions of bushels, basically, and that actually is over that span of time. And so it's rather significant as you're sort of looking at that. You can see ranges basically that, certainly in the 10 to 15 million bushels. You can see a lot of it basically in the 2 to 5 million bushels. You got a pocket over there up in the northeast portion of the state, pocket over basically where Walter Scott resides over in Council Bluffs. And again, a very heavy concentration in that, I'll just call it the Lynn County area. So then they took it a little further and they decided to take a look at, well, if we could observe these effects over this period when these plants close, then we should be able to take that same analytical approach and project what's actually occurring and what are the impacts from those remaining coal plants. And so what we'll see here is first is the lives lost. And so in Iowa, that means that for the remaining roughly 4,384 megawatts of coal, that we do have the ability to project that that those plants are having an effect on mortality rates. And it can be actually, as we can see again by the shading, even in Iowa, that basically is attributable to, up in the hundreds. Again, sort of the highest concentration seems to be over right around that Council Bluffs area, at least the darkest shading is, but you'll see it basically in many places, pretty much attributable to wherever these plants happen to still be located when we look at mortality. And what they did find was that mortality rates, again, the reason they focused on the 25 kilometers, they didn't really see much attributable in terms of mortality beyond that range. But within that range, they saw significant, basically, effects. And so they can project that those same impacts actually are still impacting us just from the remaining coal that we have today. And then maybe the thing that probably is of greatest, I'll just say surprise, but when we take a look at then corn yields. And so they looked at what are the impacts from the remaining coal plants. You'll notice that's significant. I mean, almost the entire state of Iowa is blanketed with some type of corn loss from these remaining coal plants. And so as we sort of looked at this, they didn't quantify it directly, but if we basically look at the shading, you'll note that we can easily see a range of 1 million to 5 million bushels per year, basically in about 2/3, we sort of estimate 2/3 of the Iowa counties are seeing that type of corn loss every year due to, again, those remaining coal plants. So if we take that, and so now let's calculate basically, well, what does that actually mean in terms of bushels lost? And so as we look at that, what we've got is we'll see, a minimum loss, we're saying probably 10 million bushels on a 10-year, so that's on 10 years. And then at 50, basically at 10 years as an average loss. When we then look at the annual loss per county, and we divide that basically then by 10 for the 10 years, we end up with 1 million or 5 million respectively. We're using 2/3 of the counties to be sort of the basis of the number of counties out of the 99 sort of seeing those types of losses. And so we end up with a pretty simple calculation of 66 million or 330 million bushels. And then what is the value of that? Well, if we take a look at what the price was, and I forget the exact, I think that was basically the 2021 average price, $505.58. And so we can sort of monetize this, meaning that we have a significant, loss, value loss of upwards of almost, $2 billion, and it could be $2 billion, and even a minimum loss, looking in the hundreds of millions in terms of value being lost in corn yields from the coal plant operations. So I think many people sometimes question the aspect of, well, how are we going to generate the electricity? And clearly, we have, and we did a paper basically called Iowa's Road to 100% Renewable. And we did that in May of 2020. And we analyzed different studies that have looked at, well, what would it take to be 100% renewable in Iowa? And what they found at the high end, there was a Jacobson study that found that at 46,000 megawatts of solar and 61,000 megawatts of wind, that would allow us to be 100% renewable in, they were projecting 2050. Now, to provide perspective in terms of where we are today, that means that we'd have to have about 5 times the amount of wind that we have currently. And frankly, we'd have to have about 40, we have very little solar. We have some under construction, but for the most part, that 46,000 megawatts of solar would all have to be constructed. And then we take a look at what does that mean in terms of how much land actually is required to put the 46,000 megawatts of solar or the 61,000 megawatts of wind. And so using basically some averages as far as published averages in terms of the number of acres per megawatt, respectively for wind, respectively for solar, and recognizing on wind, that's relatively small because the land that's taken out of production is what we're focused on. We're not focused on the fact that a wind farm may span thousands of acres. Solar, different as a resource, obviously, when it consumes and takes up the land, it actually is, it can be utilized as an agrivoltaic type situation, but those are, I'll just say, on the cusp of being new, and so we don't see a lot of that. But in today's sort of, I'll say, the way we actually build these resources, that means that at 100% underneath this one study, we consume 184,000 acres, or utilize, I'll say more appropriately, for the solar, and 45,750 for the wind. And recognize that this isn't, we're utilizing this, but these are leased acres. And so many times the farming community finds that is more advantageous for them to use their land to, let's just say, farm renewables than it is to raise corn. But that aside, what kind of basically, loss are we looking at 100% renewable? And so utilizing an average yield in 2019 of 198 bushels per acre of corn, we find that we can total both the solar and the wind, and we're only going to come up with 45 million bushels of lost, basically, production. And again, recognizing the economics, which says that the farmer actually is certainly able to earn more, and certainly a steady income by leasing his land, than the somewhat unpredicted nature of raising corn, as many farmers found out last year in terms of the derecho, which had a huge impact on their overall, I'm sure, bottom line. So if we compare that 45 and we reflect back just a little bit, so just so I will go back, that's a huge difference, between 66 million and 330 million lost due to coal. And we can replace it with renewable, and we're going to have certainly a lot less, basically, I'll just say, avoided basic corn loss by the 45 million compared to the 66 or the 330. And so as I think we coined it, and this to us seems to be a no-brainer in terms of where our energy generation sources should actually go, and what we should be utilizing better. Now, in the upcoming and next basically webinar, these numbers are all going to be revisited, but we're going to actually then put it in context of what does this really mean in terms of cost of generation in Iowa. And we're actually going to quantify what that true cost of coal actually is, quantifying basically in a per kilowatt hour. If we are basically quantifying all these externalities that we've been discussing here, what does that really mean? And should we basically continue down that path, or should we basically look at something else? And clearly our perspective is, yes, we should be looking at something else when we take all the impacts of whether it's climate change or the health impacts into account. And so that will be coming up next. And so just to share a little bit more in terms of things coming down the road. So again, that third webinar will be on October 13th. Please register. It is something I think you'll find interesting in terms of what the real cost is to Iowans. You can also view these webinars basically on our YouTube page, which you'll see there. And if you want to take a glimpse and get a head start in terms of what this means cost-wise, our 2021 Condition of the State report is posted on our website. And so you can actually take a look at that in advance of the webinar if you choose. And then one last thing, we are having a climate resiliency forum on September 1 with Representative Axney. And so please register for that also. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
And I will be your question moderator. I know we've had a few come in during the presentation, but I think that those got answered. So if you have any questions on your mind, please do put them in the Q&A and we can answer them here. Or I can try to think of some questions for Steve. Let's see. So we have a question coming in, or a statement that Lieutenant Governor Adam Gregg believes the coal plants should be converted to battery storage facilities for storage of wind and solar energy. Comments on that idea, Steve?
I mean, that's certainly something that's feasible. I mean, you could just as I'll just say, it'd be similar to some of the other ideas that are floating out there in terms of ways to reuse the coal plants. Coal plants in Iowa, I mean, all have solid walls, infrastructure that you can place stuff inside of those buildings. And so the example that I have is Pacificor that is trying to refurbish a coal plant in Wyoming into a nuclear plant with a new form of nuclear, sort of a thermal type storage system. Sure, you could strip out all the internal workings and potentially that might be viable. I'm not sure if, I mean, most of the battery storage that actually is out there anymore is coming in as containerized structures anyway. So I'm not sure there's a huge advantage of utilizing the structure. Maybe, I mean, there is an advantage of utilizing the plant because you're going to have a co-located substation on site. And so that certainly provides a cost advantage, but the actual plant itself, I'm not sure that provides much value in terms of reutilizing the exostructure.
Yeah, Steve, we had a request to go back to the slide that showed the future dates. If you could leave that up for folks to look at.
Yep.
There you go. And then another question here in the analysis on the land use comparison. I'm trying to think back to, did those numbers, are they just the additional wind and solar to get to 100% from where we are, or does it include everything?
That would include everything because the analysis is based on that 46,000 and 61,000. And so that's, yes, that would be we've already consumed some of that land, for instance, with the 12,000 megawatts of wind.
Yep, thanks. Okay, so we have a participant wondering if Alliant or Mid-American have responded to our analysis showing that all coal generation was unneeded. And they are wondering, why would a utility purchase electricity when having available excess generation unless it was needed for peak consumption? So first, let's start with I can say they have not responded to this analysis in any way. And Steve, I'll let you talk about the purchased electricity and the excess, the way we define it.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, the purchases are made for a couple different reasons. And so recognize that we're within the Midwest Independent System Operator, which is a transmission grid. And so all utilities utilize this mechanism of purchasing energy and selling energy within the grid itself. And so examples include things like maybe the wind resource is not actually blowing at the time in Iowa where we need the wind, but the wind is blowing over in the Dakotas. And so they're going to buy that energy basically as it's placed into the open market. And so that's another reason that you purchase. You may be able to, in fact, you will probably be able to purchase that energy cheaper in the marketplace than you can actually generate it yourself. And so that's an obvious reason why you make a purchase, is because it saves money to actually make the purchase as opposed to generating yourself. The other reason that you will see purchases going on, and that includes basically all types of resources, even basically, utilities outside of the state, same thing. They will purchase energy from our resources if they're available. Sometimes we have to have things called ancillary services. They're not actually energy, but they're services that are supplied to support the overall grid. So it's not just a question of whether or not we have enough generation to supply our customers. It really has to fit into the overall picture of how the marketplace actually works. And it's not simple. I mean, it basically is a very complex system in terms of the way it actually functions. And in fact, the utilities recognize that. They recognize that they're going to have to basically be both a purchaser and a seller of energy in order to make the system actually work.
Yes, that's a great point. We certainly wouldn't want to have the utilities running their plants during those hours when they're the more expensive option. That's part of the question as well, as they keep these plants open and running. We don't want them bidding in and distorting the market just because they want to run their plants and keep them going. So it's another complex issue.
It is, and I think we should add on to that. I mean, that is a trend that obviously we are seeing in Iowa. And so when we talk about and look back at why, for instance, we have less and less coal generation, those plants are still there. They have the ability to generate more electricity, but they're not, because they're becoming more expensive to actually operate them. And so there's a term called capacity factor. And so it basically represents you look at a plant, and let's suppose it has the capability to generate, let's just say, 1 million, megawatt hours basically in a year. And so that's a standard that says that's the maximum. Now, how much do they actually generate? Well, maybe they only generated, 1,000 megawatt hours. And so that percentage then represents the capacity factor in terms of what the plant actually did. Capacity factors in all the plants in Iowa are going down. And again, it's just a reflection of the marketplace and the fact that you're not going to sell, you can't sell energy into the market if no one wants to buy it. And so the bottom line is wind is coming in, it's dominating the overall marketplace, and we're seeing less and less coal being used just out of sheer economics.
Great questions. Anything else folks are wondering about? Give you one last chance here to talk to our coal experts, and then yeah, hopefully you will join us next time around when we will put all of these numbers in perspective. Oh, sorry, Sue. Let me go back. Okay, sorry. I some of these questions are in the chat here versus the Q&A, so I did not see them. I apologize. Sue, you asked a question earlier about whether Alliant and Mid-American have done anything to capture the toxic substances. Federal requirements have, yeah, they've required pollution controls to be put on all of these plants, as Steve mentioned. So these plants have all been equipped with the best pollution controls available. So all of the numbers that we've presented here today are after pollution controls. So there's only so much you can really do to reduce the pollution of these plants with the technology that's available. And that's why closing them and transitioning to energy sources that do not pollute our air and water is really critical, because we can only do so much. And certainly when we think about climate change, there's nothing we can do in the short term in a cost-effective way that would allow fossil fuel production to be carbon-free at this point. Let me see here. Okay. So Mid-American customers may receive a report from the company touting their high renewable generation for Iowa customers while pointing out they're selling the coal generated electricity out of state. Is there a point that the negative environmental impacts in Iowa are for the benefit of out-of-state electricity customers? Sharon, I think that is exactly what we're saying here. In Iowa, we're buying coal from outside of the state, shipping it in, burning it here, using the electricity to serve out-of-state customers. Other states are moving towards shutting down their coal operations. Other utilities have made commitments to shutting down coal. Mid-American has made no such commitment. And certainly what we're seeing is that Iowans end up paying for it, both out of their pocketbooks and with their health and pollution of our economy and our land. And so, yes, I think that is exactly the problem that we are working to make clear here. Okay, so a question on the mercury pollution, Steve, is the mercury pollution, does it end up concentrated around the plant, or is it spread out across the state and other areas?
Yeah, so I mean, that's all an issue of air deposition. And so as mercury is emitted, it goes up primarily in a vapor state. And then as it cools up in the upper atmosphere, then it will start to basically deposit. And so there's a lot of variables in terms of how far it's actually going to go. There's dispersion modeling that is always done on these plants to determine things like, for instance, the dispersion of the SO2 and the NOx. And they have to basically do the modeling to determine that they meet the standards the national ambient air quality standards at whatever range from the plant. So I would say yes, during certain times of the year, I'm sure that the deposition is close to the plant, but at other times of the year, I'm guessing that that deposition is much wider ranged, because these stacks at the plants are intended to push basically all the pollutants up high enough that it basically disperses over a large area. So yeah, it can be close, but it's more likely to be dispersed. And by the way, mercury is a particularly troubling one because it's a bioaccumulator. And so as a heavy toxic metal, I mean, it's not like it disappears. And so when the fish basically consume that mercury, the more mercury there is, the more that the fish basically accumulates. It never goes away.
Thank you. It's a great question and a great demonstration of Steve's depth of knowledge on this topic, which we really appreciate. Another one here. No, yes, that is a troubling fact about the mercury accumulation. So we have a question about whether mercury accumulation, mercury pollution can have an effect on cattle and who are on pasture.
Good question. I mean, I suppose potentially. And see, I don't think, at least I'm unaware of, that we really do, I'll just say, a lot of water monitoring that is going to be looking for mercury. We test our groundwater for various things, but I'm unaware that there's actually a testing program going on to try and detect that. And without knowing whether or not it's actually within either the groundwater and or certainly potentially, yeah, I mean, maybe the cow is grazing on grass that basically has mercury deposition on it. However, I mean, the reality is, I mean, a cow is a very big animal. And so we're talking about extremely small amounts of mercury that can be potentially, harmful to fish. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that actually it would has a pathway for cattle, and it might, but again, I don't think any testing has been done to determine that.
Thanks. All right. Any other questions? Really good discussion. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, we will give folks back a few minutes here over your lunch hour and hope to see you on one of our upcoming webinars or events. It's going to be a busy end of summer and fall for IEC. It's a critical and important time to really ramp up action to transition Iowa to renewable energy. And so we'll be hard at work reaching out to you and providing information and doing what we can to be a resource. So thank you all. Thank you, Steve. Have a great day.